General Rochambeau. Can I get one more?
Hi, everybody. My name is Brad Fay. I am the Outreach Director for the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Root Association. It's a mouthful, right? It's also known as W3R. There's 3 R's in that. And it's a nonprofit that operates in 9 states that have something in common. They all witnessed the march almost 700 miles from New England to Yorktown, Virginia, where the American Revolution was won. Anybody watch the Ken Burns documentary that came out last year? Hands? How about the new one on Netflix, The American Experiment, just out? Episode 3 has a great section on the siege of Yorktown and a little bit on the march. But if you know about this, you realize that the American Revolution was fought and won not just by the Continental Army under George Washington, but by our allies, the French. The army led by General Rochambeau. And believe it or not, they passed through this very town, marked on the French maps as Whippany, as they were headed to Yorktown. And so we're very lucky in this 250th anniversary week of the nation that Washington and Rochambeau have returned. And they've returned here to Hanover Township, and a program offered today by the library, but also to be followed by some other things later. But you are going to get the most in-depth sense of it. I would like very much to introduce to you now Father of our country, General George Washington.
General. Good day. I would like to share with you some of the campaigns of 1776. So after the siege of Boston, when we forced the British out, I knew that they were not finished. Their most likely target was New York City, and they would attempt to gain control of the Hudson or the North River, and if they could do that, they could divide our new country in 2. So once we, in March, we left, of 1776, we left Boston with the army. We left some behind to guard the position. Then we marched with great haste to New York City. And of course, the trouble with New York City and its environs is that it is all islands. You have Staten Island, Long Island, Manhattan Island. Who are we fighting? A country with the most powerful navy in the world that can land at will anywhere that they like. So how to defend? So we decided to concentrate on New York City and Long Island. And as predicted, in July, they came. Over a course of several weeks, some 300 transport ships and supply ships, over 30 ships of the line. Now, a ship of the line is the largest of the warships, and it was very impressive. There were those that commented that it appeared as though you could have walked across the harbor without getting your feet wet with all the ships there. Or it was like a virtual forest of masts. Others commented that it appeared as though all of London was afloat. So we made our preparations as best we could. We dug in because I know at that time in the war, the men were mostly still farmers. They were good at digging, but the fighting was something they had to learn about. As long as their legs were covered, they would fight well, as they did at the Battle of Bunker's Hill. So as in late August, General Howe, the commander of the British forces, he made his move. He attacked from the front on our fortifications on Long Island. We had given them Staten Island where they had camps because we could not defend all 3 areas. So this is what I expected, an attack from the front. This was in late August. But what I didn't expect was that General Clinton had learned of a way from behind from a traitor, a loyalist. He knew of a pass called the Jamaica Pass, and all through the night prior, they had marched in the dark. And I did have sentries posted there, but the sentries were overwhelmed before they could report back. So as the fighting was going on to our front, all of a sudden, we were being attacked from the rear. It was a devastating blow. The men were shocked, and many fled. And it was a disaster, with one notable exception: the stand of the 400, the 1st Delaware and the 1st Maryland Regiment. Components of those two regiments, they stood their ground. They would not move. And then, to my amazement, they fixed bayonets and charged. They would charge, regroup, charge again, as many as 6 times. Due to their sacrifice, hundreds were able to escape to our prepared fortifications at Brooklyn Heights. Only 9 returned. So there we were at Brooklyn Heights with our back to the East River. Now, I must confess, if General Howe had pressed his attack, all would have been lost. But he hesitated. He started what's called the regular approaches. Now what that means is they would be digging trenches closer and closer, bringing their guns closer and closer. So we could see that it was only a matter of time before we would be overwhelmed. So it was then that another regiment came to our aid, called Glover's Regiment. Now, Colonel Glover, he is the commander of the regiment from Massachusetts. Now, these are all hardy sailors, and he was able to get anything that would float, and in the dark of night, we were able to make our retreat across the East River. Now, as there many times during the war, Providence was with us. You see, there was a contrary wind that was keeping the British shipping, their navy, out of the East River. And then when morning came, there were yet more troops to evacuate, and then a heavy fog settled in to disguise our movements. And I also wanted to point out, he very cleverly, the sailors had put rags in the oarlocks so as they would not make any noise as they were rowing. So I was the last boot on the last boat to leave across the East River. But of course, you do not win wars by clever evacuations. So now we were into the middle of September and came to the realization that we could not hold Manhattan. And just as we were starting to move the troops out, the British attacked. I tried to encourage the men to stand and fight. They would not listen. They threw down their muskets. They threw off their packs. They threw off their cartridge boxes. Everything so they could run all the faster. No matter what I said, even taking my hat and throwing it on the ground, they would not listen. So we pulled back to a more central part of Manhattan called Harlem Heights. Now, the following day, I needed to know how far the British had advanced. So there was a unit, a regiment from Connecticut called Knowlton's Rangers. They had been very helpful in the siege of Boston. About 140 in number. And before daybreak, they went out in their search of the British lines. They did stumble upon them. I did not want a general engagement, but they were discovered and there was a firefight. Now, the troops they were up against were some of the best in the British Army. The 42nd Highlanders were there, very, very stalwart fighters. So instead of running, as the other troops had, they fired and retired, fired and retired. It was an orderly retreat. So they were outnumbered greatly by their British adversaries, and they were pushed back. But as they made their way back to our lines, the British temporarily halted. And then they performed one of the most humiliating things of the war. They had a trumpeter play the fox hunting horn. It was all a grand fox hunt to see the rebels run away. One of my aides said it was the crowning of our disgrace. So I decided that they were overconfident. They held us in contempt. We could use that. So I spoke with Colonel Knowlton, and he was ready to go back in the fight. And then I got some Virginia troops that I could trust and the Maryland Flying Camp. And the plan was to create a diversion to the front. We had General Nixon with some troops. He marched forward and engaged the British, keep them occupied in it's an area called the Hollow Way. And while that was going on, these other troops were to get behind the British troops. But unfortunately, there was a mistake. One of the guides turned too early, and what happened was they attacked in the flank instead of from behind. Now, the British realized they had been in this fight for some time. They reached into their cartridge boxes, and they found that they were empty, so they retreated. So this was the first time the Continental Army saw the backs of the Redcoats. It was a fairly small battle in scale, but it was important because the Continental Army, the soldiers, they could see that the British Army was not invincible. They could retreat. So then we moved into defensive positions. At White Plains, we evacuated Manhattan altogether because we were about to be cut off. And then during the Battle of White Plains, we kept the British occupied long enough to have valuable supplies. We were able to get across the Hudson while we held the British at bay. And then we withdrew. And it appeared as though that General Howe went back into his headquarters in New York City. But then he sent General Cornwallis after us. So we had this very discouraging time of this retreat across the Jerseys. And all during this time that we were on the march, General Cornwallis and his troops were hot on our heels, sometimes less than a day away. I always had my position at the end of the column, encouraging the stragglers to keep up and not fall behind. So then there was as we were midway across New Jersey, there was a decision point. Should we take the army and move it to Morristown, or should we continue south? So what I did was I took all the men that were sickly and wounded, and they all went off to Morristown, whereas we continued on to Trenton. Now, simultaneously to this, I had a group of men scouring an area some 30 miles in each direction to take anything that could float to get across the Delaware. Particularly prized were these Durham boats. These are large freight boats. There are no seats. They're meant to haul freight, but you could hold 30 to 40 men. So they are particularly prized. Also needed were barges or ferries because, of course, a horse and cannon is very difficult to get in a boat. So we also needed barges or ferries to get those items across. So we made it to Trenton with the General Cornwallis close behind, and he had his Hessian allies helping him. So when he got to the Delaware, there was not a boat to be found. They had all been taken by us. Now here is where they had made a great mistake. You see, the Hessians, they were German-speaking people from an area called Hesse. And they're not paid well, but as part of the way of doing things is they loot. They go into houses and take valuables to get extra payment for themselves. So they didn't care. If somebody said we were loyalists, didn't matter. They would loot the house. So this outrage, the people of New Jersey, and this brought the New Jersey militia on the attack. And throughout this campaign, the New Jersey militia made it almost impossible for the British troops and the Hessian allies to go on a simple foraging mission. They had to sometimes bring cannon with them, because these attacks from the New Jersey militia were so intense. So now, there we were in Pennsylvania. What to do? This was certainly the low point of the Revolution. But there was a booklet, a pamphlet, by Mr. Thomas Paine that came out called The Crisis. Perhaps you've heard these words. These are the times that try men's souls. And in this pamphlet, there was great encouragement to continue the cause, and I saw the value of it. And I made sure that copies were given to the men, and it was read to our regiments, and this reinvigorated them in their patriotic spirit. I did write a letter to my relative. His name is Lund Washington. He was running Mount Vernon in my absence. And I wrote to him and I said, unless something dramatic happens, the game is pretty much up. It was then in my spyglass that I looked across the Delaware at Trenton, and I noticed that there was a Hessian outpost there. And they did not fortify. They were wide open. They held us in such contempt. I learned later that Colonel Rahl, their commander, when he was told there might be an attack, he said, well, let them come. He just held us in such contempt. So I decided on Christmas Day night, we'd make the attack. So in those very boats that we used to escape, and the barges, the German boats we used to recross the Delaware, and it took much longer than anticipated. I wanted to be attacking Trenton at daybreak, but due to delays, we didn't actually attack until 8 o'clock in the morning. But the weather was horrendous. There was snow, there was freezing rain, there was sleet, every imaginable terrible kind of weather. This all worked in our favor because the Hessians did not believe we would attack under such conditions. So we split the army in two. We had part of the army on the river road following the Delaware, and then we had another part of the army on the Pennington Road. And the armies, these two divided brigades, came together and attacked at 8 o'clock. Now, muskets are very unreliable in bad weather, but cannon is reliable. And Henry Knox had brought some 20 cannons. And when the alarm went out and they formed their troops, as soon as they tried to form, Henry Knox was pouring cannon fire into their ranks. When they tried to man their own cannon, as soon as they tried to fire, Henry Knox was pouring fire into them. So it was over very quickly, and we were able to get troops behind them and cut them off. Now, interestingly, there was a somewhat humorous event. We actually had a regiment called the German Regiment. They were men that came from the area, and they all spoke German, and they were calling out to surrender in German, and the Hessians were mystified to hear in their own language to surrender. It was all over very quickly, and we lost only 2 men, and that was to the cold. 2 men froze to death. So we took our Hessian prisoners, their valuable cannon and other military accoutrements, and we recrossed the Delaware. Now, when the British and Lord Cornwallis in particular found out, they were furious. So they mounted an attack. They were based mostly in Princeton, and they made their way from Princeton to Trenton. Now, there were several things that slowed them down. The weather was actually fairly mild, so as they trudged along the roads were soft and muddy, and that slowed them down. And then I had sent men forward to fell trees and to shoot at them, to force them to go from line of march into line of battle. And this slowed them down until they did not reach Trenton until late in the day. Now, we had set up our positions. There was this small river there, a creek, and on the other side of the creek, we had our positions, and there's only a very narrow bridge. Only one wagon can pass at a time. So to their credit, I must say, to the bravery of the British soldier, they made, yes, it was the Assunpink Creek, that's correct. They made several attempts to charge the bridge, but between the musketry and the devastating cannon fire, they were decimated. So finally, they gave up. And I was told later that when General Cornwallis was enjoying his dinner, he raised the glass and said, "We will bag the fox in the morning." Now, there was a general who was familiar with the area, and he told me that there was an unknown road to the British that went around them. So I decided, rather than have another battle that way, was to march the entire army in the dead of night. So I had men working on the entrenchments as if they were trying to improve them with their pickaxes and shovels. This to fool the British to our intentions. And the wagons and the cannon were wrapped, the wheels were wrapped with rags so they would move quietly. And then, as it was in the night, the roads that had been muddy were now firm and hard, and we could march with alacrity to Princeton, our objective. So we marched for the remainder of the night, and unfortunately, due to the fact that our army was spread out, General Mercer was in the van, and ironically, there were British troops leaving Princeton to reinforce Trenton, and they did not understand the numbers involved, and they attacked. And sadly, a good friend of mine, General Mercer, he was mortally wounded. But then I was able to come forward with reinforcements at a critical moment. And I was actually, at one point, I was standing between the two lines. And I was told later by one of my aides that he had his head hidden in his hat. He didn't want to see what was going to happen. The British let loose their musketry, and I was unharmed. And then I motivated the men. I said, I remembered that insult from earlier about the fox hunting calls. So I said, "It is a fine day for a fox hunt, boys." And we pushed them back and we took Princeton. Now, I had the thought of perhaps moving on to Brunswick, but the men were at the point of exhaustion. So we decided to go to Morristown, New Jersey for our encampment. Now, although these were not large battles in terms of some of the others that had took place during the war, these battles were significant. They have become known as the 10 crucial days that saved the revolution, because where all had seemed lost, now it was shown that there could be victory. So at this point, I wanted to turn it over to General Rochambeau. He can tell you about the importance of the French involvement. I must say, without the help of the French, it could not have been done. So there will be an opportunity for questions for both of us before the end of the presentation. So, General Rochambeau.
Mesdames, Messieurs, c'est un honneur d'être de retour parmi vous. At this point, I might switch back to English. How is your French? All right, I'm going to stay with English. So my name is Monsieur de Vimeur. It is my family name. My title is Rochambeau, Comte de Rochambeau. And I'm here back a year almost after being in Whippany. The year is 1782. It's the summer of 1782. My troops and myself are making our way back to Rhode Island, to like north from here. So you can imagine that I have the time now after the victory in Yorktown to talk to you. I've seen all of you, and by the way, I'm looking at the number of people today, that's about 20% of the town of Whippany at that time. Whippany was 30 houses. I would say maybe 200 people. I'm really glad that we stopped in Whippany. But before we talk about the march to Yorktown and what led to it, I wanted a little bit to introduce myself. I think I feel the need to introduce myself as like our first visit in the summer of 1781 was pretty fast. Yes, indeed, the French troops had a rest day here, so I was with them at that point. So I spent, let's call it 3 days with you. But like, as you can imagine, I had military matters to take care of. But more importantly, my English at that point was pretty much inexistent. So I have to thank the good people of Williamsburg, where after the Battle of Yorktown, I spent the winter. There was the habits of retreating to winter quarters. I mean, we talked about the General Washington and the Continental Army having winter quarters around here. There was the same from the French troops. So during my time in Williamsburg in the winter of 1781, 1782, I had the time to learn English. So otherwise I would need a translator, and that would have been a bit difficult. So you see me today at the age of 56 with a cape. And it's fashionable in Paris, that's true. But I need it. I need it. I've been a soldier for like 40 years. How did I become a soldier? At the age of 14, actually. So it's more than 40 years. As a French noble, my family was supposed to dedicate the first male born to become a soldier. And I was not the oldest son of my parents. So at the age of 6, 7, I was actually planning to become a priest, Catholic priest. Unfortunately, my older brother passed away, and I had to follow the orders, you can call them orders, of my father. Said, you are going to replace your brother and become a soldier. That's how I left what was the equivalent of like college at the age of like 13 and joined the French army. So for the next 40 years, I was away from my home for most of the time. I was coming from a region in France called Loire Valley. You might have heard about it. It's in some ways the heart of France. Very, very sweet life. The weather is incredible. The food is great. The wine is even better. But nonetheless, I could not be there for most of my adult life. As you might remember, the King of France at that time was at war for a good chunk of the decades. Those wars were not always successful for the French. And what it means is I've seen a lot of actions, a few victories, and a lot of defeats. And what I can tell you is one of the reasons why the General Washington and myself were able to be successful at Yorktown. We were able to be successful on the march down to Yorktown and fool the British troops is because of some of the lessons I like to learn also like European battlefield during my adult life. So going back to the cane is actually I've been wounded like 4 or 5 times between the shoulders, the hips, you name it. So I need that cape to rely on my feet, to stay on my feet. I was about to retire at the end of the 70s, so 1779, let's say, when the King of France asked me to take over these troops that he was planning to send to help the American insurrection. And I can tell you, as a French noble, it was interesting to digest those news, as the French person would not rebel against its king. So, nonetheless, my king asked me to organize this expedition. So, what's going to be known as the Expedition Particulière was organized very quickly so that in the spring of 1780, I could embark from France, from Brittany in France, with close to 6,000 troops to cross the Atlantic and land early in July, just after my birthday, early in July 1780 in Rhode Island, in Newport, more exactly. So that's a little bit some of my background. And by the way, I would really encourage you to ask questions. I know my life or the French involvement are not always really known, remembered, I should say. So feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. Something I wanted to mention before is you were here for a treat to hear General Washington talk about his battles. Was an immense treat for all my officers. A lot of those officers were quite young. They had, some of them are experienced battles, some of them did not. But nonetheless, all those battles and like the victories, but also the defeats or the problems encountered by the Continental Army were of the utmost importance for those officers. So any occasion they had to engage, it was usually very difficult to engage with General Washington directly, so it was very busy man. It was much easier usually to ask some of his officers that like also witnessed those battles for maps and like pour over maps and explain all the movements of the troops. So once again, you should be like really glad to have heard like the General Washington describe those battles for you. As I'm talking about maps, because we're like pouring about maps, looking at maps and trying to understand all those like movements, I wanted to mention those two specimens here that we have. So from far away, you might not see all the details, but I would really encourage you to, as you leave the room, spend a little bit of time on those. There are amazing example of some of the secret weapons that the French brought with them. I'm smiling saying that. Nonetheless, what I should say is maps were an incredibly important part of the military experience at that time. It was the main way to describe the position without seeing it. It was the main tool for my aide-de-camp to work on the trip from Rhode Island all the way to Yorktown, the road to Yorktown. And a young man made those. Incredible engineer, incredible artist at the same time. They're like very, very detailed, as I said, and they need, as a general, I need to be able to see on the map what maybe is not available because it's dark, it's not available because you have cannon fires and the smoke related to like musket fires. So this young man who made those maps is Monsieur Berthier. And it's really after our time. Here we are in 1782. But this young man, Officer Berthier, became Napoleon's like marshal. So he had this amazing career, going first, fighting for American independence, but all the way through the French Revolution and all the way through the Napoleonic Wars. I'm going to escape for like a minute or so, 1782, as we are today, and just let you know that in this a little bit bigger town of like 80 houses, that's called Princeton, there's like maybe like 500 people. You have this college, the College of New Jersey. This college has a library. And up to the July 12th, if you go to this College of New Jersey in Princeton, you are going to be able to see the original versions of those and many other artifacts of the War of Independence. I would really highly recommend that trip to you. And in 1782, the roads are safe, so feel free to drop in your wagon and go all the way to Princeton for that special, very, very special event. I wanted to move a little bit to the French involvement. And I'm not looking to go really into all the details, like the story is very long and pretty complex. There are like a few points I wanted to insist on. The first one is I mentioned my arrival in July of 1780 in Newport, Rhode Island. With me comes roughly like 5,000 troopers. Those troops were actually more numerous than the Continental Army at that specific time. Just gives you an idea of the importance of having those like French troops support the Continental Army. That's pretty obvious. Something that also became obvious is the financial help that the King of France brought to like American independence. And here, by the way, I should say that as members of the Whippany community, you have been actually involved in some very indirect way into the French Revolution. I wonder what that's.
Yeah.
Aha. So, one of the major reasons of the French revolutions is the state of the French coffers. The amount of debt accumulated by the French king led to higher and higher taxes, led to, at the end, what first was a revolt and became a revolution. And part of those debts were incurred during the American War of Independence. And some of that was actually spent in Whippany. If you were to encounter, like 2 years ago, British soldiers, as the general said, they would just say, give me what you have. And by the way, I have the musket, and by the way, I have the sword, so you are not going to win that. So the British forces would just loot. The American forces would give you paper money. And became really quickly clear that the value of this paper money was decreasing extremely fast. The French, and that's the credit to the French king and all the government behind me, we decided very early to win the hearts and the minds of the American people. One of the ways to do that, there are like many others, one of the ways was to pay in gold for everything we purchased. Were we eating apples from the apple orchard? We'll pay for them. Will we gather woods for campfires? We'll pay for them. What was amazing for Whippany, that had like suffered greatly, and you remember that, during the prior years, so prior to our arrival here in 1780, is crossword of the revolution, as the state is known, is one thing. What it also actually means is you have encountered numerous troops needing forage, numerous troops looting, numerous troops destroying your houses. So the situation in Whippany in 1780 was pretty harsh. And for that matter, like during the march to Yorktown from Newport, Rhode Island, all the way to Yorktown, usually my troops will just sleep over and then move on the next day. For like Whippany, what was great is actually we had a rest day here. So instead of staying 1 day, we stayed 2 days. So more money was actually pushed into the Whippany economy. And what I should say too is actually it was more than 2 days. As you can imagine, the roads for those thousands and thousands of soldiers with thousands of oxen, with like hundreds of horses, wagons, artillery, those roads could not handle over one single day such a large number. So for most of the walk in New Jersey, I actually organized 2 columns. So the first column stopped here for 2 days. The second column came here. We used the same facilities, but stayed for an additional 2 days. So that's a little bit what I wanted to say about Whippany, with something also very important that I should mention. Is it's in Whippany that I told my officers, then told our troops, that the goal was not to attack New York City, but to go south. At that point, we could not tell them it was all the way to Yorktown, but at least for the first time in many months, they knew where they were going and they knew what the target was. As you can imagine, I had to maintain discipline because our troopers got quite excited about finally knowing, after all those miles in the heat of the summer, after all those painful encounters with the British, we finally knew where we were going. So I see it's already like a 4:45. There's like some unsung heroes also I wanted to mention. One of them has nothing to do with military history. One of the unsung heroes are American Oxen. When I landed with my troops, the number of transport ships was not sufficient for us to take much outside of men and fighting men, like trained soldiers. We could not even take our horses. Even as a general, I could not take my horse. Imagine you have one horse for weeks and weeks. Instead, you have maybe 10 soldiers. The choice is really easy. So once we arrived in Rhode Island, in Newport, one of the first tasks was to rebuild all the elements that are needed for the modern army to function properly. It has to do with intendants, so it has to do with finding horses for the officers, but also I came what was called the Legion of Lawson, that had about 200 what's called hussars. I don't know if you know about hussars. They are terrific riders and amazing fighters. Those riders had to find horses, but more importantly, for all the wagons, for all the artillery that we brought, we had to find oxen. seems, so far, I don't see anybody like really surprised or really interested. Oxen are amazing. They made us like walk to the whole walk to Yorktown much easier. So I said, hey, we walked all the way from Rhode Island to Yorktown. There's this huge river in between. It's called like the Hudson River. To have thousands and thousands of troops cross the river is a feat. When you have like thousands of oxen pulling the wagons, actually also crossing, how do you do that? How would you do that? You don't know. Well, the oxen swim. They swap across the Hudson. And have you ever visited the Hudson River?
Yes, yeah. Daddy was born right in the Hudson River.
All right. It's pretty large. I would not want you to like swim across, but the oxen did. So that I just wanted to mention that they deserve a mention. On the military front, the element that was essential, and General Washington mentioned it a little bit, I just wanted to emphasize that point, is that the French-American operation was a combined operation. Means it entailed heavy involvement of the French Navy. Without the French Navy and its admiral, at that point, de Grasse, the outcome would have been like vastly different. And they really provided all the support needed, but also they blocked the British. Going back to the march from Rhode Island to Yorktown, marching was not evident. It was actually a feat. The main way to move a large number of troops and cannons and all the equipment and the food was using the waterways, using the Atlantic Ocean, using the Delaware when possible, Chesapeake when possible. So having the French Navy with us meant that the British could not move their troops the way they wanted, as fast as they wanted. And that was really essential. Having said that, I should maybe open to questions that you might have, either for our esteemed General Washington or to myself.
How big was your army?
The main troops were 4 infantry regiments. Each was roughly 1,000 troopers plus their officers. So here you have 4,000 men. Then you had what I call the Legion of Lawson, had like 600 men. And it was a mix of riders, so cavalry units, with some more like specialized troops, with some infantry troops. Then I had a full detachment of that artillery. And on that front, something that I would like to mention is, as we talk about the French involvement, the Battle of Yorktown, this like pivotal battle, was a siege event. The esteemed General Washington and the Continental Army had some knowledge about siege warfare, but input of the French engineers, more importantly, the input of what's called siege artillery, so pieces of equipment to launch projectiles on fortifications, was essential. And all those pieces did not exist in the Continental Army and were used in Yorktown for that purpose, coming from my contingent. And some women actually were also in my troops. Not many of them, but as the months passed the number of women increased. And something else I might want to mention about those troops and the number of like roughly 6,000 men. Once again, on foot. Once again, that's an army, but the Navy itself had like more than 10,000 men, like mobilized for the American attention. Sir?
What I wanted to ask you, the French troops that fall they fight side by side, whereas where they divided in some respects. How did you handle the discipline, the lack of communication, and so forth between the two armies?
That's correct. Sure.
One more thing for Washington. When you came up to Princeton, well, you agree to Monmouth, the Battle of Monmouth? From my understanding, the group of heads that you brought coming from Trenton were significant and made New Jersey a very principal staging area for pursuit of the British. But there was a diversion into Monmouth, and that was a much larger battle.
Well, we'll let the first question be answered, then I'll answer your question.
Sure. The orders I received from the king were extremely clear. I am under the command of General Washington. We fight side by side. And you might have read that in the papers after the victory in Yorktown. Some of the British officers wanted to surrender to me, and I had to make sure that General Washington was the one receiving this honor. So I did not have time to expand that much, but I mentioned some of the lessons I learned during my military career in Europe. One of them is the importance of communication, the clarity of who is in charge, and in this case, I was fully under the orders of General Washington. So were my troops.
But as an example, I might share, at the siege of Yorktown, there were two, as we moved in on them, there were two readouts we called them number 9 and number 10. So it was decided that those readouts would be seized at night. And so the French were assigned to readout number 10, readout number 9, and we were assigned to readout number 10. Now the man that led this with our light infantry was Alexander Hamilton. So this was a combined attack with our allies, but we were separate because there could be confusion where the commands would be given in French with one and the commands with English with the other. So even though we were fighting at the same objective, there were two different contingents so that there wouldn't be confusion. But there was, of course, a lot of interaction. But there was, of course, the language barrier because I do not speak French. Fortunately, many of my aides are very educated men, and they were able to translate. And of course, there were some in the French army that would speak English. So anyway, your other question about the Battle of Monmouth. So what happened was at the Battle of Princeton on January the 3rd, 1777. Now what happened was we separated into our winter quarters. And then in the summer was the Battle of Brandywine on September the 11th of 1777. We were somewhat outmaneuvered and we were pushed out and we lost the Battle of Brandywine and the British took possession of it. So we went into our winter quarters at Valley Forge after the Battle of Germantown. So what happened was in the spring of 1778, we got the glorious news that the French were were to be our allies, and there was great celebration in the camp. But there was great consternation amongst the British command, because now they were in control of Philadelphia, but they were isolated. They could be cut off by the French Navy. So they thought, aha, what do you do in Europe? In Europe, you conquer the enemy's capital and the war is over. So they thought that by conquering Philadelphia, which was our provisional capital, they thought the war would be over. But they gained nothing, really. The war continued, and they found themselves in an exposed position. And in the late spring and early summer of 1778, they decided to evacuate Philadelphia and march to New York City because there wasn't enough transports. They couldn't go by boat because there weren't enough ships. So among my staff, we decided what to do. Should we simply allow them to march unmolested across our country, or should we hinder them in some way? So a small force was sent first under Lafayette, but then it was taken over as more troops were engaged by General Charles Lee. So the idea was to harass them, their elements as they were leaving, which ended up being Monmouth, the area known as Monmouth Courthouse. So they turned around and fought the British, and I came forward with reinforcements, and the army was in full retreat because they were not given proper commands. So we were able to set up a defensive line, and we brought the British attack to a halt, and then we in turn, which they were surprised. So in some cases we attacked them with the bayonet, which we had learned the use of at Valley Forge under the tutelage of General von Steuben. So the British, in the morning, the British were gone. They continued the following day, they continued their march to New York City, so we held the ground. So when those that hold the battlefield are the victors, so I saw myself as the victor of that. So the Battle of Monmouth was months, many months later than Princeton.
General? If I might, I see that we've approached the 4 o'clock hour, which was our appointed hour to be finished. I think there's probably time to be doing some mingling with people individually, but before we do that, I would like to introduce another illustrious gentleman from the American Revolution. General Anthony Wayne is with us today, and I'd like to ask if he might step forward to introduce himself, and I'm sure a little reunion would be totally appropriate here.
General, it's been a few hundred years. Looking good.
Very good.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out. This all-important year this year. Well, a lot of people don't realize 250 goes from last year till 2033. So we have a long schedule ahead of us. But this is the all-important year. I am General Anthony Wayne. Some people like to call me Matt Anthony. We'll get to that. But I've just been part of Washington's, General Washington's staff. I've been fortunate enough to be in Rochambeau. Thank you, sir, for joining us. And
So he'll speak later at some additional length when we have the pre-fireworks event outdoors. But I just wanted, since he was here, we should acknowledge his presence, and perhaps you'd all like to do some mingling.
thank you.
All right, very good. Thank you, generals, for your authoritative words. And thank you all.
Thank you all for coming. This was one of our 250, 350 events through the Hanover Township. There's a whole schedule of events through the rest of the year, including tonight. As Brad mentions, the patriotic celebration will also feature a colonial parade at 6:30, going right down North Jefferson. And there will be presentations by the generals and proclamations to follow the parade. And then fireworks and food trucks and everything else to be after that. So please stick around if you can, or come back later. You'll have to exit this area and then come back because they're closing off the street. But please join us And then to see our website, hanovertownship.com/250-350. 250-350. It's right on our homepage as well. There's a whole schedule of events throughout the rest of the year. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And one last introduction, if I might. We are very fortunate today to have Mr. Chris Sands with us. He is in his color guard uniform. He is the statewide president of the New Jersey Society of the Sons of the American Revolution. A real treat to have him with us today. Thank you, President Sands.
Everybody can do it. Just the different stuff, historic markers and materials. So you turn it
So
in.
I'm not moving, I don't know what are your plans, General, but if you have like more questions, I'll be like happy to answer.
Look closely at these maps, they're really cool.